Okay, so hi everyone. I am Jemma, or as some of you may know me by Elizabeth Ton. So I have been working on getting together some more chats and online conversations, and among Marxist Leninists everywhere, but particularly on the Australian left as well, accelerated along by the reality of us all being stuck, at least somewhat partially, in quarantine or homebound more than usual. And something that I thought would be good to kick off with is a debate between Jay and Maki, both of whom I personally consider to be opposite communist thinkers in their own right, on the question of China, which I think can be useful for people to consider some ideas that they may have held about China with a bit more nuance, but also to bring together and find similarities in two opposite sides of this debate among Marxist Leninists. Because what we've noticed is that both Jay and Maki, respectively, have tendencies to, in some ways, represent the political traditions of their homelands on the question of China. And what I mean by that is that while, of course, you both have individual positions on this, which don't entirely fall into any particular party line, but that typically, Jay, you would sit closer to the Malayali communist tradition and the CPIM position on China, and you, Maki, the Greek communist tradition and the KKE position on China. And myself, of course, I figure I would be ideal to play a sort of moderator role, although I'll be doing a lot more talking rather than most moderators in YouTube debates typically seem to do. So I've noticed that the debates on this question tend to fall into what I've elected to put into three major categories. That being China's internal politics and its perceived capitulation to either capitalism or socialist reform, and China's commerce and trade globally, and whether or not the Chinese model of socialism is applicable to the West and the goals of socialism in the West. And of course, for those of you who aren't aware, to briefly summarize, I'm sure we can get Jay and Maki to do this in a second, but just to briefly summarize, the official positions of the KKE and the CPIM on China. The CPIM consider the Chinese strategy to be one akin to Lenin's new economic plan, that being a reconstruction of capitalism whereby what has arisen is a commodities market under the control of a socialist state for the specific purpose of raising living standards. By comparison, the KKE are critical of expanding Chinese influence over global resources, the increasing success of the yuan as a reserve currency, as well, of course, much of their criticism stemming from disputes with China over control of the Piraeus port. So I think what we'll have the most to talk about is China's role internationally. One of the problems that I often encounter in online debates, and which honestly makes me want to staple my eyeballs sometimes, is that on the question of China, the West and left tend to get lost in what is sort of a semantic debate, because there's never an agreement on a definition, firstly, of socialism, and then secondly, of imperialism. And either of you, of course, may even disagree with the need to define them, which is also completely relevant, because I also personally think they don't necessarily need to be defined, insofar as what we are ultimately discussing is political consequences rather than definitions. So I'm sure you will both also agree that China's current role in Africa and other poorer periphery nations is not necessarily exploitative. But I guess my first question to kick things off would be, what is imperialism and how does it pertain to the role of China in the globe today?
Sure. So imperialism is national exploitation as opposed to capitalism, which is class exploitation. Now, when I say this, a lot of Marxists will think that's not what Lenin said. Lenin said that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. I understand that, but unfortunately, if you look at the model that was presented by a lot of early European Marxists about imperialism, it did not actually contain mechanisms of national exploitation. What it did was that it took the mechanisms of class exploitation, that is the exploitation of workers by capitalists, and then it just imposed that on the rest of the world. So, for example, to a very orthodox Marxist, the British exploitation of India was basically the British capitalist class exploiting the Indian working class, just as they had exploited the British working class. But of course, there's problems with this because India as a continent was exploited by Britain. We know now through the works of Utsa and Prabhat Patnaik that and they're two very prominent Indian Marxists. They're both members of the Communist Party of India Marxist. that there was a net transfer of wealth of 45 trillion from India to Britain. Now, this sum and the relevance of this historic process are usually not well known, because what it did was it allowed Britain to establish what I call currency hegemony. That is, Britain became the net exporter of capital for a long period of time, and this is what allowed for industrial capital to develop in the zones of European settlement, if you like. So that is North America, the United States, Canada, here in Australia, New Zealand, but also South Africa. A bit of it went to Argentina, and the rest of that capital that was exported went to Western Europe. But those capital exports would not have been possible without the drain of wealth from India. So you can think about it this way, that if you look at Lenin's definition of imperialism, he defines, in many ways, the export of capital as being one of the defining features of imperialism. But what this ignores is that this export of capital was actually a privileged economic relationship that Britain had with Western Europe and the Anglo settler states. It was not the mechanism by which Britain exploited its colonies. So, how did Britain exploit its colonies? In the case of India, they set aside 1/3 of the tax revenues that were raised from the Indian population to then buy goods from India, which is a one-way transfer of wealth from India to Britain. And they operated similar systems of exchange rate expropriation, foreign exchange expropriation in other colonies as well. And this was replicated by other empires. So these are the actual mechanisms of national exploitation that are predominated throughout history. And if we were to summarize the rise of the West, it would be that firstly, the Iberian powers kicked off the rise of the West. That is Spain and Portugal. They established their currency hegemony by extracting large sums of gold and silver from the Americas, and then with that, they stimulated the development of Northern Europe. Then, out of Northern Europe, Britain emerged, and they established their currency hegemony at the expense of India, which I already talked about. The United States is that it inherits its position of hegemony from Britain. But unlike Britain, which was presiding over a world that was becoming increasingly under the control of a handful of European powers, the United States was faced and is faced to this day with a rapidly decolonizing world. The two largest countries which European colonial rule before the Second World War are now independent countries. That's China and India. So when Lenin was discussing things, China did not have much agency because it was a subjugated nation. All of its ports had been occupied. After 50, 60 years of post-colonial development, China is now a major capital exporter, and this leads a lot of Marxists to the conclusion that China must therefore be imperialist. What I'm saying is that what is it that allows China to export capital? Is it the process of the drain that the British imposed on India? No. China's capital is generated internally through the exploitation of its own working class, right? Objectively, that's what's happening. Obviously, they're generating surpluses. And then they're exporting this capital to other countries. So what's unusual is that a lot of people think that the export of capital from China to Africa is similar to the Western relationship with Africa, when actually it's closer to the relationship between Britain and a country like Australia, or between Britain and a country like Canada. Both Canada and Australia experienced industrial development. Okay, so in a sense, China is actually bringing the benefits of industrial development to a lot of African countries. So this is even development. It's not underdevelopment. It's not national exploitation, and therefore it represents something very different. It represents the evening of industrial processes throughout the world rather than the intensification of uneven development, which is what presided during the era of European colonial empires. That's my argument.
Maki, would you like to respond? Do you agree, disagree?
Yeah, look, I think there are parts, of what Jay just said that I agree with, and there are other parts I disagree with. In terms of the question of the definition of imperialism, my view is that I hesitate to take an overly technical view towards the question of imperialism, and that is because I think that we've observed in history a danger of creating a general rule from observing a tendency at one particular point in history. I think that when you read Lenin on imperialism, there are certain things that need to be said. whilst it may have been accurate for its time, I agree with Jay. We now know different things about the nature of, for example, British colonialism in England, in India, and we know further things about the development of imperialism and the way that certain relations of production have changed. One thing, for example, that's telling, if you have read Lenin on Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, is his assessment of the development of German capital. You look at the state of the firms that he's analyzing and their size, and he's still talking about, production, major production and monopolies being concentrated in firms that employ over 50 workers. We're now talking about companies that employ hundreds of thousands of workers. Now, these existed, albeit, to a limited degree at that period in history. But with the expansion of capital, the increasing concentration of capital that we've seen in the 100 years since Lenin wrote his famous work, those relations of production and the means by which production is organized have also changed. So on the question of what imperialism is, I think it's actually safest to look at the broad definition, which is, simply that imperialism is the means by which powerful nations exercise their influence politically, economically, and militarily over other nations. And primarily, in the periods of history that we've seen, and especially in the last 200 years, this has concerned itself with the extraction of resources and the use of systems elsewhere to gain resources for the imperial country. Now, that depends to an extent, obviously, on the use of military force, and obviously presupposes the existence of superior military force. So I really wonder if we're disagreeing in any radical sense, but I do favour a broad definition.
Hey, I think the broad definition is better than Lenin. I think when you said that Lenin's understanding was accurate for its time, I tend to even disagree with that, because I think even for his time he was wrong.
Well, yeah, I think I agree. And just to qualify that point, it's not that I think in the face of what he understood, he was correct in certain respects, right? But when you have a fuller picture of what imperialism actually looked like in India and what the economic relations were between Britain and India, then I think it is correct to say that in some objective sense he was wrong, if that's what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, there were people, like there were two very important texts that came out in 1901 and 1902. The first was by Dadabhai Naoroji, who was the Indian nationalist, and an economist who first talked about the drain, about the fact that India was being drained by Britain, and that's what allowed Britain to be the leading imperialist capitalist country. But at the same time, you had Hobson. Now, Hobson went on to influence Lenin's understanding of imperialism because he wrote a book by that name. So in a sense, Hobson gave birth to the word imperialism, whereas Dadabhai Naoroji didn't really use it, but that's what he was referring to. He was referring to Britain exploiting India. The thing is, Hobson, he did not recognize that the British were draining India of its wealth. For him, he said that, the statistical basis for this is unsound. He didn't even he acknowledged what the argument was, which is that 1/3 of Indian taxes were set aside to buy goods from India. He acknowledged that argument, but he just didn't take it seriously, and he didn't even mention Dadabhai Naoroji. So what happened is that Marxism, from Lenin, Rosa Luxemburg, Kautsky, from Bukharin, like all of those European Marxists, they took Hobson seriously, but they completely ignored Dadabhai Naoroji. Now, for whatever reason that is, I don't care. I'm not really judging, but I think what's important, and where I think Lenin is certainly. Lenin should certainly be understood for his time, is that he was trying to empower the communists in the advanced countries, which is what he says. He says, communists in advanced capitalist countries, that's his audience. So he's trying to empower them with arguments for convincing the working classes of the various empires participating in World War I to use the opportunity to launch simultaneous socialist revolutions. So he's trying to stop a war. And if you're trying to stop a world war, it does not help to tell these workers that they benefit from imperialism. You get what I'm saying? So there's actually the reason I say this as well is because in other writings of Lenin, he fully acknowledges that the British exploit India, right? Like he's very clear about it. So to give you a quote, Lenin said, as a result of the extensive colonial policy, the European proletarian partly finds himself in a position when it is not his labor, but the labor of the practically enslaved natives in the colonies that maintains the whole of society. And about Britain, he said, the British bourgeoisie, for example, derives more profit from the many millions of the population of India and other colonies than from the British workers. So in a different text altogether, he recognizes national exploitation for what it is. But in the context of World War I, when you are trying to foment revolution, it makes more sense to say that the working class of the empires do not benefit from imperialism.
I see. I think, look, the only other thing to pick up on was there was a little bit of a divergence, I suppose, about two issues we were speaking about. The first was, on the question of whether it's possible to also be exploiting, for the British to also be exploiting their own working class at the same time as they were exploiting, the working class in India. I understand the distinction you're picking up on there, but I don't also believe that the fact is mutually exclusive. The fact is acknowledged, I think, that there was you might say, a hyper exploitation of India. There was, in fact, a plunder of its resources, a drain of capital, a drain also of surplus value. And at the same time, of course, all people in the United Kingdom, in Britain, to a degree, benefit from this exploitation in the sense that it increases the cheapness of raw materials, the factors of production, and it enables a higher living standard in the UK. At the same time, I don't think there can be any realistic dispute about the fact of exploitation in the United Kingdom of the British working class, but that doesn't appear to be what you're arguing either.
No, I think this is where, I am actually an intersectional Marxist.
Oh, God.
Because, that's
term.
Go ahead.
Just to pick up on that, so you're both relatively disagreeing with Lenin's definition, and obviously his more quoted line is that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. So I guess in terms of relevance to China, do you both agree that it's possible to be capitalist but not imperialist?
Yeah.
Yes, roughly. Well, yes, with a due sense of trepidation about what further development will mean for China. I think that the simple answer to this is that imperialism, to a degree, is a matter of fact. It isn't something that's mystical. It isn't something that's obscured by forces that we can't see. Imperialism is something, I think, which may be difficult to define at points, but it's easy to understand when you see it and when you understand the feeling of it. I think the tendency of, the basic need of capital to continue to expand means that at a stage of development, in order to continue to expand your markets, you at some point come into conflict with other people and their own desires about how they'll use their own resources. So I think at the initial stages of development, it's possible for a capitalist country to not be imperialist. I think, however, that the internal contradictions created by that society, the private interests that emerge within that society, means that even if there is an ideological, which I suppose is what we're getting at, an ideological commitment from the state not to become imperialist, that will begin to conflict with the desires of capitalists within that country for access to resources and the desire that they would see of their state to increase their access to those resources. So I think there is certainly a conflict that emerges, and it's a matter, I suppose, of the unfolding of history to see how that will actually develop in practice. So while it's possible, I wouldn't hold my breath, if that makes any sense. I think this is something that waits to be seen.
Mm.
So it's subject to its own internal contradictions, in other words. Do you think that's true, Jay?
Yeah, so the argument that Lenin makes is that as finance capital starts to dominate industrial capital, because I think this is one thing that's not understood. Lenin, in a sense, disagreed with Marx because Marx, he predicted, he didn't push it too strongly, but he basically said that over time, interest-bearing capital will be subordinated to industrial capital, whereas Lenin said no, history has moved in the opposite direction. Finance capital is subordinated industrial capital. And that's why he talked about, imperialism as being the highest stage of capitalism. Under capitalism, there's the lowest stage of capitalism for him was free competition, and industrial capital was engaging in this free competition. But then over time, as the concentration of production intensified, which is where he obviously agreed with Marx, finance capital tended to subordinate industrial capital. And then as this happened, because you have large concentrations of money, finance, they then have the ability to influence the political system, which then pushes for war and then annexations and then conquest and colonies. That was basically his argument. But the problem of saying that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism in this sense is that you know what you're assuming that imperialism had nothing to do with the development of capitalism to begin with, which is another major contention of mine. So the very birth of capitalism in Britain was premised on the plundering of India, and if you go back even further, the plundering of the Americas as well. Whereas saying that imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism assumes that it comes after capitalism, and therefore imperialism, if we attribute to it the definition of national exploitation, had nothing to do with the origins of capitalism to begin with. And that, I think, is a fundamental problem.
I think there's a degree to which I can agree with that. I mean, certainly it's true that finance capital appears to be more dominant. The only issue I'd have with that is that it isn't so obvious that there is a divorce between industrial capital and finance capital in the way finance is actually structured in the modern world. The structures of ownership at the development of capitalism were relatively simpler. You had large capitalists, large firms. Increasingly, you did have the emergence of joint stock companies. But what we've seen, especially in the 20th century, is the emergence of different funds and the extent to which finance companies, banks, holding firms, and all the rest of it command to huge funds that have been invested in them, but then begin to wield a disproportionate influence over their use and exercise. I think that there is a basic question here about how we believe value is created, because if we accept the labor theory of value, which I do, which is that the ultimate source of labor or value is actually labor and improvement on raw goods and materials, production itself, then you still require an industrial economy or the production of goods or actual labor to have profits. So, finance capital still requires investment. The only thing is that these companies, these major American, especially corporations, and major international corporations that have developed a huge financial power in the world, have then begun to diversify their funding into other industries. So you do actually see the emergence of a class of capitalists in the world who use complicated structures to control and invest their money. But that money is still usually invested in the real economy, and those profits derive from investment in the real economy. Now, that is not to say that it isn't possible to otherwise gamble on financial markets and, in a limited sense, profit from currency fluctuations and all the rest of it, but I'd hesitate to draw a very clear distinction between finance and industrial capital in circumstances where industry does appear to be the basis of the majority of finance as well.
The only point that Lenin really is making is that ultimately industrial capitalists, they put their money in banks, and therefore the banks become the concentrations of capital, not the fixed capital factories. That's the point, yeah.
So as China moves closer towards a consumption economy, is it an issue that the yuan is becoming a much bigger reserve currency in its sort of Southeast Asian periphery nations and increasingly in Latin America and so on?
I think it depends on what on the basis of that currency. So if you look at the United States, they've had currency hegemony since 1944. And up until 1971, they were a surplus economy, so they were exporting more than they imported. But it's actually a part of their it's a part of their geostrategy to make sure that the rest of the world doesn't develop so that they can maintain their position of power. That's fundamentally what imperialism is. It's when you say we want to suppress the development of other countries in the world in order to maintain our position. And that for the United States has became increasingly difficult throughout its innings as a currency hegemon. First, because of the challenge of the Soviet Union, which aided the industrialization of of the tricontinent, Latin America, Asia, and Africa. And then, of course, China is doing the same thing. But I think when it comes to the question of currency hegemony, we need to be really, really nuanced here. The reason why the United States, I would argue, is imperialist is because of how its currency hegemony functions. The rest of the world has to churn out exports for the US dollar. I mean, ultimately they accept it, so there's like a voluntary quid pro quo relationship going on here. But the US dollar um, uh, is fundamentally like the only currency in the world that is able to run large trade deficits, that is import far more than they export. And that is because of the role of the US dollar as the world's reserve currency. So this is like a free lunch, an exorbitant privilege that the United States is getting from the rest of the world. Now, China coming into the picture and starting to counter with their own currency is actually weakening the stranglehold that the United States has over the rest of the world. The rest of the world is ostensibly doing this voluntarily. They're not. I mean, obviously, I say that with quotation marks, which you can't see because the United States can invade countries and things like that. But there is a reason why they would do that. To the extent that the United States in the past held technological monopoly, countries had no choice. They had to export their raw materials to the West in exchange for the high value added goods of the United States. But now they have China, so there's competition. China is now technologically, I would say, ahead of the United States on most areas. And so China is able to then offer its own currency as like an alternative. So what I've noticed is that China, they offer grants in their own currency, but they offer loans in the US dollar. So really, China's happy to give away its own currency because it knows that it's good for it, whereas the United States has been actually has significantly reduced the amount of money that it's loaned the rest of the world. The United States, ever since 1985, has become a net importer of capital. That is a net debtor nation. It borrows from the rest of the world. After the global financial crisis, what did it do? It borrowed large amounts of money from China. So the United States relies on loans from the rest of the world, and the rest of the world is happy to loan money to the United States because they're scared. That is the essence of imperialism today. China bears none of those characteristics. It's a productive economy, and the rest of the world has quid pro quo relations with China that are not based on any military threat from China.
I think that's largely correct. I mean, the only thing I would say to that is a couple of points were raised. Firstly, on the question of whether China is ahead of the United States technologically, China has quite remarkably, as a result of its opening up to the rest of the world, been able to develop a number of technologies in collaboration with other major capitalist countries. We saw that one of the problems of the USSR closing itself off to the rest of the world is that, especially with regard to information technology, computer technology, it was behind, and it was forced to build an economy on the basis of that fundamental backwardness because other countries were not able to invest in it and did not want to invest in the USSR. That hasn't, of course, been the case with China. They've been able to attract investment, and I suppose here is where one of the disagreements between me and Jay may set in, that this investment in China was initially largely presupposed on the basis of China offering itself to the West as a cheap labor platform. Now, as to what that means, I suppose we can discuss that later. But effectively, I disagree with the point that China is ahead of the USA technologically. I think that the most advanced firms in the world are still those which are producing, microchips, those which are producing advanced computer equipment, those involved in advanced genetic technologies. Those, I suppose, which are most advanced in the development of information technology, computer technology. And these still do appear to be the United States, Korea, Japan, Germany, the countries which have shared that long history of collaboration and development in these technologies. Now, obviously, China's catching up very rapidly, and a number of these firms are producing in China. But I think it is an important point that China's ability to develop this technology rests largely upon the extent to which the rest of the world accepts China as a trading partner. And I think this is where we go back to the question of imperialism and currency wars. China has been, rightly you would say, just like any other nation, attempting to influence the value of its currency, to have its currency used as a reserve currency, and of course it it uses monetary and fiscal policy to change the value of its internal currency as well. I would say for the benefit of its own population, and for the purpose of developing investment in the Chinese economy to a degree. Now, America has increasingly begun to react to that, by using or attempting to use the mechanisms of the World Trade Organization and using its military and political power in order to threaten China effectively, that look, if you keep doing this and if you keep doing this in a way that annoys us, we're going to react. And we have seen, of course, that even under Trump, there has been a reaction, there has been a response from the Chinese government to these American threats. So, for example, tariffs on steel. These have an effect on China, of course. And all goes to show, I suppose, that the threat of the US military and its capabilities, which at the moment are still, of course, unsurpassed, is really the dark horse in the race here. At the moment, China's been allowed a period of development, but at any stage, the USA could make that extremely difficult. And we are still in a position where, most of the powerful countries in the world will listen to what the United States of America tells them to do. And that is a long-term, I would say, existential threat to China, but it's also a threat, I would say, to the ability of China to develop and access world markets. So there's a delicate balance that goes on here.
I think with the point at which we can, if we treat imperialism as something cyclical, which is my approach, then the point at which we can worry is when China becomes a trade deficit nation, and after that becomes a net importer of capital, that is a net debtor nation that lives on credit.
I agree. In these circumstances, I would agree.
Yeah, that's when you should be worried. But the thing is, the fact that China is a trade surplus nation, which is what it is today, it just means that they're a very productive working class. They churn out the goods that the rest of the world wants, and the rest of the world wants to do business with China. It's not coerced; it's completely quid pro quo. And for that reason alone, I don't see any imperialism.
Oh yeah, I'm not going here to the question of
you're
whether
not saying
China's
that. Okay,
imperialist.
sorry.
I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is that China's position in the world and the degree to which it's able to threaten the USA, the US dollar as the reserve currency, is largely a product of the tolerance, I would say, of the USA at the moment. The USA is able, as we understand, to exercise influence over most of the governments of the world, and where those governments don't listen, the USA is able to send an army in. We've even seen, for example, in the case of Australia, a huge disagreement between the USA and China about Australian policy, and that's having its own implications on Australian politics. You see that America is making what appear to be subtle threats, and China's responding in the same way, and the Australian government is largely a pawn between these two powerful states playing out this conflict. But what we've seen in Australia, for example, when this game has played itself out, is that Australia has been more concerned with appeasing the United States in recent years than it has been with appeasing China. Whereas I think there was a stronger attempt to balance between the two powers and understand our dependence on both of them, even as much as 10 years ago.
Just to tack onto your point about technology then, Maki, you're right that it's lagging behind in the production of microchips, but China does have somewhat uneven development in technology, and some areas where it does lead, for example, is in AI production. For example, they're able to roll out large-scale infrastructural projects which engage in forms of behavior tracking, which then, in turn, increase the effectiveness of AI that they create, which can create a feedback loop through to military production. So one area where they are considered a threat by Silicon Valley is in that.
I suppose I agree with you there. The question of uneven development is important. There are some areas in the economy where China is necessarily going to have an advantage. It also has, for example, rare earths, which it can mine and it can extract, and it can use in the production of its own technology. So in the long term, I suppose, or perhaps even in the medium term, it represents a threat to Silicon Valley and to other industries around the world. I don't deny that there are very advanced firms operating in China. What I'm talking about is the extent, the role they play in the overall economy and the extent to which they can compete broadly. One of the problems with the technology industries, I mean, if you go and take apart any advanced piece of military equipment anywhere in the world, you'll probably look at half the products being produced by Samsung, half of them being produced by Hyundai, half of them being produced by Japanese firms. There are international components which are sourced. It's very few countries which are self-sufficient entirely in the production of these technologies. And, there's a large degree to which in the advanced technologies at the moment in the world are dependent upon international purchases. So I don't believe that China's at the stage yet where it's entirely self-sufficient in these areas. So there are some risks. We saw that the USSR managed to adapt itself to those risks. But it's a question, I suppose, which, again, remains to be answered in the next few years based on how the Chinese economy actually develops. I mean, I'm not sure that it will pose a threat in the long term to the technology industries of the more advanced countries in the world, technologically speaking. But I hesitate to make predictions as well, so we should see.
Okay, is it time to move on to the second topic, we think?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay, so the second topic is the question of whether or not China is currently socialist. We all know that China has vast and expansive programs for the alleviation of poverty, and that they've been the only country, at least in the last decade, to have successfully done so. But its detractors will say that this is merely the product of moving exploited agrarian workers into harsh manufacturing work, for example, or similar to that, and that China experiences internal contradictions that necessitate a radical shift further towards socialism, such as a large housing bubble and possible overconfidence from billionaires and so on. So the question I would posit to you both is China socialist? Does that actually matter? And is their current system sustainable? Or if it is not, are they likely to move further towards socialism?
Yeah, look, so what was the third question? Sorry, Jemma, I'll just write it down so I remember to answer it.
Is their current system sustainable? Or if it's not, are they likely to move further towards socialism?
Yeah. Okay, look, on the question of is China socialist, it's a complicated question. Like, I don't agree with taking, ultra positions on this and fighting among each other. We've seen these huge disagreements on the left about the definition of China. I think there's an extent to which that debate is important, but it's less important in terms of assigning some, foreign value judgment as to what the Chinese are doing with their economy and what they're doing with their political development. I suppose it's more important in terms of what our expectations are of the development of politics and of political states in the world. I suppose I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. But on the basic question, we first, I suppose, have to determine what we mean by socialist. So when we're talking about socialism, we're talking about the absence of private property and capital. We're talking about either nationalized systems of ownership or collectivized systems of ownership. I suppose there have been differences in those two terms. And we're talking about largely the removal of private capital from key sectors of the economy. I say key sectors of the economy because in any state, obviously, there are going to be areas about where private trade exists, whether it's in agriculture or whether it's in small businesses in the cities. Now, I would define China as a mixed economy, and that is because there is a huge state sector in China. It's powerful, it's influential, and we have seen that, especially in the early 2000s, 95% of Chinese economic growth was attributed not to the private market, but in fact to internal infrastructure improvements, internal programs of development. On the other hand, China has a huge private economy, and a private economy which obviously started to grow from the early 1980s, especially towards the early to mid 2000s. There is in China the existence of, unfortunately, thousands of billionaires, and I'm sure many thousands or perhaps millions more millionaires. Now, that obviously represents a huge appropriation of wealth that was produced from the working class and has ended up in private hands. We also know that these firms invest internationally, and of course, like all capitalists, I presume Chinese capitalists are moving their money offshore. Well, not I presume, we know. They're moving a lot of their money offshore, they're buying things in other economies, and they're living a wealthy lifestyle. Now, that obviously represents a threat to the ability of the Chinese state to develop on the basis of the creation of capital and the creation of value from its own workers. Obviously, if profits are in private hands, there's a real threat. Because there's wealth being extracted from the system that should be used for the development of the system, and instead it's used to prop up the private lifestyles of millionaires and billionaires. And then, of course, we go to the question of whether this is sustainable. I think there's a real question about whether it is sustainable. And on the question of whether China's socialist, I think you might say that at the moment, even if we can say optimistically that it remains a mixed economy, it remains an economy in the hands of a communist party that frankly does appear ideologically committed to a degree to a form of socialism, whether you call it socialism with Chinese characteristics or otherwise. The problem is that if we allow the ongoing development of private capital in China, then those private capitalists who own their firms, who own their factories, and who have certain expectations about their access to resources and what they're going to do with it, these will begin to, these people and these capitalists, their firms and their organizations will begin to exert influence on the Chinese state and will begin to have demands on the Chinese state which are not consistent with the development of socialism. Private capital to exist must grow, as we know. They're unlikely, for example, in a major factory in China to look at valuable land next to them which is being used by the state for schooling or for whatever else, and to say, oh, look, that's happy, we can be happy with the existence of this. They're likely to try to acquire these state resources. I think that represents a threat, and I don't think we should be blind to the extent to which that could create internal contradictions which overwhelm the capacity of the Chinese Communist Party to control them. So I would say that it's not sustainable, but again, there are many variables in human behavior and there are many variables in history. So I suppose it's up to the Chinese state to see how it will deal with it and what its commitment is to it. The major threat, though, I would say, is whether it's possible for the Chinese state to control an economy so large, to control a population so large to the extent to which it can start to monitor the perversions of socialism which occur at the hands of these private interests, I would say. I think that does represent a real threat.
I look at it this way. So I call it, the definitional question, is China socialist? For me, this is more a question to do with propaganda and public relations, quite frankly. And the reason I've come to that conclusion is because of the Marxist dialectic between the abstract and the concrete. They're almost irreconcilable sometimes because the concrete very rarely lives up to the abstract. So, attempting to create a kingdom of heaven on earth very rarely would live up to the idea of what, the kingdom of heaven would be like after you die, to give you a religious example, or any other ism as well. I mean, this is what defenders of capitalism find themselves in as well. Many of them, like libertarians, they'll say that's not real capitalism, but then they only want to claim the benefits of a capitalist country for capitalism and say, that's true capitalism. And so there's a tendency, I think, to be too puritanical about this in both directions, So you can look at China and you can look at its imperfections. That is the extent to which it's not an egalitarian society, the extent to which it doesn't even discipline its capitalist class, and say, well, to that extent, it is not socialist, it is capitalist. And then on the other hand, you can look at the extent to which it has managed to spread wealth evenly and raise living standards and lift 800 million people out of poverty, and you can say, well, that is because of the extent to which it is socialist. And so these definitional questions really will get you nowhere. It's like looking at a glass and saying, is it half empty or half full? And so I would much rather reserve the question of, is China socialist, for the concrete situation that we find ourselves here in Australia, which is a country that throughout history has defined itself as being, free market, capitalist, a part of the West, and everything that goes with it. And therefore, socialism has always been a curse word in Western countries, So during the Cold War especially, it was the ideology of the geopolitical enemy. And on top of that, it was also considered to be a poor system, an inefficient system, to the point where all of the advances of China in the ideology of capitalism in Australia, as it expresses itself, they would take all of those achievements as achievements for capitalism. They'd say that capitalism achieved the lifting of 800 million people out of poverty in China. Capitalism achieved the technological dynamism of China. It wasn't socialism at all. And part of the reason they were able to get away with saying this is because so many socialists themselves wanted to distance distance China from the concept of socialism, and I think that's fundamentally wrong. I think the fact that China will in the next 10, 15 years definitely overtake the West in terms of the living standards for the average person. The average Chinese person will have better living standards than the average Westerner, and at that point, it's going to be positively against our interests as socialists to not claim those advances for socialism. That's my argument.
I think I would say to that I really wonder whether what we are talking about is definitions, because I agree these really nuanced debates about whether China's socialist and what that means. It seems that what the real question is and what people are actually asking themselves on the left is how do leftists or how do progressive people orient to China? And in some respects, it's a less important debate than the debate about the Soviet Union, because the Soviet Union, on the other hand, quite radically intervened in the class struggles in every other country in the world to the point that it was a material question, because it would influence how you behaved as a workers' movement and also what support as a movement or as a party that you would receive from the Soviet Union. I think that with respect to China, the question, given our limited control and our limited possibility of controlling the development of China, we don't really have a say, we don't have an influence. This is a country obviously for the Chinese, and it's a matter for them, in China to determine what course of development they want. That's not to say we don't have a role there, but I think we need to acknowledge our limitations in actually having influence on this question. The point about, whether this is a question of dialectics between the abstract and the concrete, we understand something real by the definition of socialism. There might be some debates about, the extent to which something is socialist and when it becomes socialist and when it becomes capitalist, but we do seem to be talking about a state that's in the control of the working class, a state that does what it can to abolish private ownership, private property and capital, a collectivized or nationalized economy, but also then there's the international question. To what extent is China assisting class struggles elsewhere? And that might go to the earlier question that was asked about whether the current system is sustainable. If there isn't international support, if there aren't access to international markets, then I think the Chinese state may end up suffering the same fate as the Soviet Union. So on that basis, it's an important question, but...
Jump in there.
Of course.
When you said, the question of, which class is in power, I think that's a very fundamental question. So you look at the Soviet Union, and you and I would both agree that, yes, the working class were in power.
Yes.
Now, if we look at China, it's obviously complicated by the fact that they've got so many billionaires. But I guess going back to my previous point, and then I'll return to the point that I'm making here, the only reason I think we should be championing the idea that China is socialist or associating China with socialism is because we can then claim their achievements for socialism, and that would make us look good. It would create the ideological conditions for us having more political power as communists and socialists here in Australia. This is a very realist proposition that I'm putting forward. As for the question of which class is in power, being able to answer yes to the working class being in charge in any country, even the Soviet Union, comes down to the problem of abstract versus concrete. Because if you say that this is what the working class being in power looks like, then you've already established an abstract standard. Whereas my standard is, I would argue, far more objective and concrete, insofar as the question I ask is relative to Australia, relative to the West, what is the position of workers within the Chinese system? Okay, yep. So I would argue that in China, the power relations between capital and labor are tilted more so in favor of labor than they are tilted in Australia between capital and labour, or in the United States between capital and labour. And Steve Keen agrees with me. So the Australian economist, I remember listening to him a long time ago, and he said the working class in China actually have more sway over their system than the working class in Western countries do. Now, that's something that I think should be shouted from the rooftops in order to advance the cause of socialism.
I don't disagree with that. I think, firstly, they have actual control over certain major institutions in China, but secondly, they have the actual capacity to control. And I think also there can be no question about the fact that in Australia, the working class is depowered and removed from the political system. And in fact, its main organs of power, being the trade unions, are actually in a state of active persecution in Australia that, frankly, despite what we may hear about China, you don't see mirrored in China. There is, for example, the existence in Australia of an ABCC that criminalizes fundamental human rights and fundamental rights of union organizers, union workers, and frankly, workers to fight for their rights in the workplace and to fight for wage increases. So I agree with you to that extent. I mean, the one point that I do disagree with you on is on this question about whether it's an abstract question. I think that given it's pretty well understood that what we're talking about with respect to, let's call socialism an abstraction, not that I agree for the moment, but if we say that socialism is an abstraction, the question then to me is the extent to which China approaches this abstraction. And I think that is the essence of what we're debating, even if we're defining it differently. The only point that I would raise is, I think, to agree with you to an extent, I don't think this is the key issue. Like, there's something very strange about, teenagers online carrying on about why China's socialist and for what particular reason. It's different to have analysis. It's different to determine whether politically this is something that we should support. But these things which become little more than, arguments about value judgments as to whether we support something that isn't related to our actual political discourse and the sort of lived political experience, to use that unfortunate term, I think is futile. So I agree with you. The real question then is the extent to which this impacts upon our position in Australia. But on that,
I'll give you an example, just like one very quick example. There's been a lot of corruption cases and inquiries in Australia over the past year. Now, if we were to start asking the question, what would these politicians get in China, and then make that a very public and loud debate, I think you would see some significant concessions and changes in just at least the political culture.
I think that's possible. I mean, the problem is for me that corruption doesn't appear to be foreign to any political system. I mean, to be honest, the USSR was the one system that had it under control more so than anywhere else in the world, because there were real risks, and obviously there was no existence of private wealth. So it was pretty easy to spot when you saw it, and when you saw it, it was finished. China, on the other hand, seems to be grappling with similar problems of corruption that Australia is grappling with, except that they are grappling with them. And obviously they're grappling with them in a more extreme way, in a more public way. I really wonder, though, whether that doesn't just beg the question, well, if they're forced to resort to such extremes, how widespread is the problem, and to what degree are these state crackdowns actually dealing with the issue of corruption in any systematic fashion in China? To me, the problem on this question is that I actually don't see a fundamental difference. I mean, you might be shooting the corrupt billionaires as opposed to putting them in prison or subjecting them to nasty inquiries. But in the end of the day, the problem they're grappling with seems to be a similar one. They're trying to deal with it. I'm not sure that anyone would look at that and say that in any fundamental respect, there's something other than a superficial attack against corruption going on. And when I say superficial, I don't mean that the attack against corruption is in and of itself superficial, but I think these sort of public trials, they serve a political purpose.
I think in the long historical march of order and chaos, the last period of major chaos in Chinese history produced an order which I think has a level of class struggle that is far more advanced than any other state, barring perhaps like North Korea or Cuba. Yeah,
I was just going to throw in a possible example. The friendly Geordies in quote unquote investigation recently. If there was a mass exodus from rural areas in China that was happening by government design, and which, I mean, there has been, but it was for very different reasons. It would be something that would be covered by international media. And it's not something that it would receive international scorn, or doesn't receive any international scorn in Australia. But can continue. What
and actually, I forget my previous point, because this raises another point which I think is perhaps more interesting. There is a danger that I would put to the general Australian public in playing into this excessive demonization of China, because all it does is uphold Western exceptionalism. I'm pretty sure we're all in agreement here. When you believe that because I think we live in a climate in which China is increasingly demonized, okay? And so in that climate, we have to tell people, look, this demonization of China, you might think that you're protecting yourself from this country, but actually it's going to affect you. Because if you think that your country is relatively morally superior to China, then you're going to do less about rebelling against it when it becomes corrupt and oppressive.
I think that's a point with which we all agree. I mean, the real question is the origin of this sort of antipathy towards China, and that's largely explained by the preponderance of ridiculous American propaganda that's in every country, in every newspaper, on every TV channel, and especially in Australia. I mean, people carry on like psychopaths on the question of, China purchasing a farm in Australia, and they ignore the fact that the largest investor in the Australian economy is the United States of America. Like, this doesn't seem to be an issue to them. Yeah, the largest, the most damaging, and frankly, there's never any scrutiny applied to the nature of that American investment and how it affects the Australian economy, how it affects the Australian political system. I mean, similarly, it's like you said before, something goes wrong in China, it receives international attention. Something doesn't go wrong in China, it still receives international attention. China is condemned unfairly, and this is all part of upholding this mythology about, Western exceptionalism.
Yeah,
frankly.
and it hurts us. It hurts us.
It hurts everybody as well, because it has the effect of saying, well, the USA are the good guys. The USA are our allies. Look what China's doing. China's oppressive. China's murdering people. China's buying everything in the Australian economy. But look, I really hesitate, because there must be a degree to which it isn't simply based on propaganda. There is an element to which it is based simply on racism. If you see the reactions of people, and I suppose that sounds quite unscientific, but we know that in ordinary discourse, when you hear someone say, oh, the Chinese are buying this, the Chinese are buying that, it's something that seems so superficial, so ridiculous, when they know that we're part of an economy where all nations invest, or capital, I should say, from all nations invest in Australia, and it doesn't attract that level of condemnation or scrutiny. So there is a question here about the I suppose, to what degree it originates in racism, and whether there isn't a separate question about the political purpose of racism on this question as well.
Look, I think ideology is very important here, because if you look at the Chinese ideology, even down to the swearing of allegiance that the police officers in China give, usually it's to the people of China. Here the cops give their allegiance to the crown. So I know that that's just like symbolic, right? But I think if you dig deeper into the ideology, the political culture of these countries, in China, their government came to power on the back of a revolution. It could only have existed unless it had the support of the Chinese working class, and mainly peasantry, actually. The Chinese peasantry, the Chinese proletariat, in very large numbers. And that's something that has not happened in Australia. Australia has never had a revolution in which a new state was created on top of the old one. Yes, we've had the Eureka Stockade, but that was not a revolution that was successful. So China is a country that has a long history of successful revolutions. If you look at Anglo culture by comparison, they haven't had a revolution since the 1640s under Cromwell, and then the Glorious Revolution, which is a bourgeois revolution, but in any case a revolution. So since pre-capitalism, Anglo society has not had a revolution, whereas China managed to have a revolution that was within capitalism, and therefore their political system, I believe, is far more attuned to understanding the problems of capitalism, including its ideology. So for in China, if you say that the right to private property should be some kind of a holy, sacred it should be something that's sacred, people will laugh at you, right? Like, nobody considers those opinions to be normal in China, right? The way people look at it is, well, if you're a capitalist, then you better be a productive capitalist. That's the only reason the state should allow you to continue operating. If you're a parasitic capitalist, then you should not be allowed to continue functioning. Whereas in our society, parasitic capitalism is what's driven out all of the industry. Why don't we have manufacturing in Australia? It's because the way that the economy is structured, the house prices are allowed to inflate and go through the roof because they've become a means of storing wealth rather than a means of housing people. And as a means of storing wealth, it means that the wages of workers have to go up as well. So you have to pay workers so much money so they can pay off their mortgages. And then obviously all of the industrial the industrial centers are going to leave. So we've deindustrialized because we don't even differentiate between parasitic capitalists and productive capitalists, but the Chinese do. So even in terms of running capitalism, they show that socialists are better at it. And that's where I disagree with this one thing that I hear socialists have said for a very long time, which is they say it's not our job to run capitalism. And I say, no, I disagree. I think the job of communists should be to say, this is how we will run capitalism. We'll do it better than you.
So I think we can move more into these comparisons soon, because that's what the sort of third aspect of this debate, I think, should be. But I just wanted to quickly see what you guys think about, does China eventually need to subsume its capitalist class back into the state? Is that an internal contradiction that has to eventually be dealt with?
I think so, yes. I mean, I actually agree, surprisingly, that there is a reason for the existence of a private economy in China. I think that you need to fend off some of the more aggressive imperialists in the rest of the world by trading in their markets, giving them limited supply to your materials. But I think the purpose for this, for the Chinese state, ultimately needs to be cynical. They need to be allowed to trade and to buy goods on an international market. I do think that an embargo situation such as the Soviet Union saw, or such as Cuba sees now, would actually be fatal in the long term to Chinese development. Having said that, however, the Chinese state does need to take actual measures to control its corporations, take a level of responsibility for the way they behave internationally as well. Because that is a propaganda point as well. People want to see Chinese firms behaving in an exemplary fashion, and I think that's good for left-wing propaganda for the Chinese state in any event. So I don't see that should be controversial. But look, it does appear that in recent times, China actually is taking some efforts to control major corporations. They're increasing the influence of the Communist Party on the major firms, but yes, it does need to arrest the growth, I think, of the private economy, and it needs to confine that to certain strategics, to confine the private economy to certain strategic centers where the Chinese state determines it's in the interest for this private economy to exist. The only thing I want to say about all this, because at some point, talking like outsiders seems slightly ridiculous. We are talking about one of the most sophisticated, advanced states in the world. Like, what China has done with its economy and with its political system is almost unprecedented in world history. We've seen states at parallel stages of development, like India, for example, who in the same period of history have had a private capitalist economy, and there is no comparison, obviously, to the level of development that exists in China. China is far more developed. It has a much larger working class. It's has to a huge degree eliminated some of the more dire examples of poverty that you see in India. There is less inequality. So these very sophisticated questions are understood and are being answered to a much greater degree within China than they are here between, obviously, me and Jay or anybody else. But to the extent that we can observe them and that we can look at other historical criteria, history has proven to just drag you by the nose when you think that you're ahead of it. People who are trapped in a particular time and place and think they're understanding the development of their own country. In the end of the day, I mean, who expected, for example, the decline of the collapse of the USSR almost overnight? Nobody did, right? So to that extent, I think it is fair to comment on these things.
Well, can I just add on to that?
Yeah.
That I just want to make it fully known that I'm very aware that this is a completely indulgent debate, and that ultimately all that really matters for us as Australians is how we relate to China on the ground, right, with Australian workers. So yeah, but ultimately, yeah, the question that I was asking is, do either of you think
Do they need to be subsumed? The capitalists
back into the state? Yeah.
Yes. Look, I think that history has proven that when you think you're ahead of it and when you think that you're in control, you're actually not. I think that there probably should be a limited. There should be an agreement among leftists that capitalism can represent a danger to China. I think there is. To some degree or other, we sort of look with a level, I think, of trepidation about what's going to happen with this private economy. To the extent that it poses a threat, yes, I think the Chinese state should get it under control, and that this needs to be a very serious, perhaps even a primary consideration of the Chinese state for its long-term survival and longevity.
I just think the class struggle is eternal.
Well, it is, but I mean, isn't that the point that if the Chinese Communist Party, as the head of the Chinese state, wants to actually retain, socialism with Chinese characteristics in China, considering that the class struggle is eternal, and considering that the capitalists are the class enemy, I suppose, according to that ideology, they need to be kept under control. They need to be subsumed within the state.
No, I agree. I think the only reason I'm saying that is because I think a lot of Marxists seem to have a second coming of Jesus understanding of the revolution.
Yeah,
so, there's going to be a revolution, it's going to be the end of history, and then socialism is going to reign, and, the abstract idea in our heads will become a reality. Yeah.
It's something we've been saying for a good 150 years, I suppose, as well.
150? I think we've been saying it for 2,000, 3,000 years,
Probably,
so...
Yeah. You did have what you would call, I suppose, a revolutionary re-exploration of ancient Greek mythology during the period at which Athens was at its height as a revolutionary democratic power as well.
Yeah.
So it's not foreign. I do recall reading in Aristotle that, words to the effect of that, the major driving force between political disagreement, the major origin, the actual ultimate source of that is class, is wealth and poverty, and the battle between the wealthy and the poor. So this was a tendency that was observed by them, and of course it would have been observed also by the civilizations that came before Greece. So yeah, the class struggle is definitely eternal. The question is how we, I suppose, win that class struggle and which side we find ourselves on.
I agree that that it's unpredictable, but I think this, for me, is the contradiction between idealism and materialism. I don't think that materialism, dialectical materialism, came to do away with idealism. I think they complement each other in the following way. Materialism is important for understanding the world. Idealism is important for changing it. Now, we were talking previously about what our opinion about China should be within the Australian context, and that's the perfect example. We know deep down inside that the contradiction between the abstract and the concrete will always make the discussion about defining socialism difficult. We know that, right?
Yes.
But because we realize that we are also agents of history, that we're also agents of change, change requires telos. It requires a meta-narrative about what happened in the past and where we're going. So, for example, in Islam, everything before Islam is jahiliyyah. It's ignorance. Whereas, after the Prophet Muhammad comes, that's when, progress actually begins. And in many ways, I think that's a constant feature of all revolutionary ideologies.
Yeah, I would say that it's a feature of all progressive thought. I mean, most progressive-minded people, and obviously many religious organizations, if we want to go down that route, you've got an idea of what you want the world to look like, necessarily because you expect that the world is in a state of imperfection and you want to make things better for a particular group of people or the majority. I think that's what distinguishes us from the capitalists. I mean, the capitalists don't need a vision. They just want to enjoy their money, enjoy their profits, maintain a system that's already working for them. There's an inherent danger, of course, in having any ideology where there is an ultimate outcome. And, it's like we say, you set out to make a revolution, you end up killing each other. It's not predictable. There are too many variables in human behavior, and we should never, I suppose, discount the influence of the unexpected in history. So this is why I think we do need to be constantly analyzing, constantly vigilant, and why there is something valid in criticizing states which, to some degree or other, we think that we should be supporting. I think that's the other question. There's a point about which it's seen to be illegitimate, for example, to criticize what China's doing because it's accepted on the left that the ultimate enemy is the USA. I think that there is a danger in this, because the danger is that in our complacency, in our lack of criticism, we give cover to China and we retard the development of our own political ideology and our own political organizations elsewhere in the world. One of the more embarrassing things for the left that we've ever seen was the uncritical extent to which Gorbachev, with his reforms, received support from the communist movement. I mean, looking back, the positions of those parties, all of them in the world that took that position, was frankly ridiculous. I mean, we can look at it with hindsight as ridiculous. Part of my concern, I suppose, is that we should ever avoid making these historical mistakes, which are not grounded in analysis, but I think are grounded in a lack of criticism or, frankly, taking a factional position.
I think ultimately the thing about China and the Soviet Union is that that China was able to develop largely as a counterweight to the Soviet Union. So if the Soviet Union didn't exist as an independent country, or let's say in an alternate timeline it was completely swallowed by the Nazis and divided into 12 different countries, and if it wasn't a threat to the West, then maybe China would not have had the opportunity to develop either, because there would have been no reason to prop up China as a counterweight. So I think that's basically what happened with Gorbachev. He expected that having carried out, because Gorbachev and Deng Xiaoping were contemporaries of each other. In China, it was working, and that's very simply because the United States was willing to invest in China. They weren't willing to invest in the Soviet Union. They wanted to destroy it completely. And so countries do not have the same paths that are open to them. China took advantage of a very rare moment in history, which is when the United States needed a country to step up, produce, and in exchange industrialize. They at least get that. So it's not like British colonialism in India, but with the understanding that there's an expiry date, and that expiry date is when China catches up, and that's pretty much happened.
Well, I think, frankly, the period of capitulation, I would say, to the foreign policy of the USA by China is probably the most shameful period in Chinese history, and perhaps one of the most damaging periods of history in the 20th century. So, whereas they may have taken some temporary advantage from that, I think in the long term, China is the worse, and the world is the worse off for the collapse of the Soviet Union. The ability to project revolution internationally is something that the USSR was, to a degree, effective at, but in any event, it was interested in. If China is to sustain itself in the long term, it's not going to be able to do so alone. It needs large, powerful allies. At the moment, it's seen increasingly as a threat by the rest of the world. How do these conflicts usually resolve themselves? Well, at some point, they resolve themselves through conflict. Direct military conflict. If that's to happen, I think that would be a disaster for China and for the world.
This is the problem with teleology, right? Because I'm not accusing you of being teleological. I'm just saying you use the word shameful in terms of China's relationship with the United States. And I understand where that's coming from. So if you look at, for example, foreign policy, I mean, my God, in the 1980s in Afghanistan, they were producing weapons for the Mujahideen. In Africa, they were siding with, Mobutu. In Angola, they sided with UNITA against the MPLA and Cuba and the Soviet Union. So they've done this throughout history. Now, maybe that was the deal all along. They said, you know what, we will go along with American foreign policy, and in exchange, the United States will help us industrialize. But now that China has industrialized, they're actually performing, I would argue, a progressive role in the post-colonial world by their economic relations and willingness to do business and export technology.
So, while China may be labelled capitalist, what all three of us can agree on is that the form of capitalism we experience in the West looks very different from China's, the primary difference being the maintenance of the pretense of liberal democracy in the West. But also, of course, China has protectionist-style laws, particularly around the housing markets, that Australia or America don't have, and they also regulate foreign direct investment to a greater degree than either. But then, of course, there is a widening inequality in the West that, by comparison, in China is being actively stamped out by heavy government spending and multitudes of social programs. So my question to you both now would be, would we benefit from a Chinese model, and why? And how would you explain this to, like, your average Australian worker?
Yeah, sure. Very simply, I think the Chinese system of governance and statecraft is the most advanced in the world. They do not treat private property as some sacred right. They do differentiate between productive capitalists and parasitic capitalists, and they try and weed out the parasitic ones. They have far more stringent laws and punishments against corruption, and I would argue that the working class has a far more, like, the power relations between workers and capitalists is tilted far more in favor of workers in China than it is in Western countries.
I think there's a huge political tension. It's obvious that there is a huge tension in Australian politics between our reliance on investment and purchase of our raw materials from China, and on the other hand, our political relationship and military relationship with the United States of America. The Australian ruling class has in the past, both Labor and Liberal, tried to play a balancing act between the two powers. Now, when you get increasingly pro-American governments like we've got at the moment under the government of Scott Morrison, you see that there's an overt orientation in a manner that's offensive towards China, an overt orientation towards the United States of America. Now, in this conflict, the Australian public has been largely passive, and I think it's able to be passive because they've been conditioned to a degree where they're, reflexively, you may say, supportive of the United States of America and its role, and they've been conditioned to see China as a threat. Now, that has real effects on the development of Australian politics. It means that whereas there are Chinese investment initiatives like the One Belt, One Road initiative, which are objectively, you would say, in the interest of Australian workers, we are unable to take advantage of these opportunities without huge American scrutiny, huge American intervention, and intervention to a degree that we wouldn't see. I mean, the Australian public doesn't recognize the extent to which articles which are anti-Chinese or articles which are pro-American are actually originating at the direction of the US State Department, for example, or at the Murdoch media's behest. And what that means is that our political options are limited and our economic options for development are limited, and they're limited by the uses to which the United States of America wants us to put our economy and political society. So, whereas the question was, would we benefit from a Chinese model? There's, I suppose, no prospect of a Chinese model unless we're able to preserve our independence politically as a country. And that requires, unfortunately, the dangerous task of holding off American imperialism and the United States of America's influence over our economy. I think that we would benefit from being able to make decisions which allow us to take the best from the Chinese system and take the best opportunities from Chinese investment and implement them here, most certainly. But look, there are certain things that we have developed in Australia as a product of class struggle here, which in a capitalist context are suitable. It seems to be a much longer term question, I think, than the problem that we currently face in Australian politics, which is getting the public to take a role in this push and pull between the USA and China, and getting the Australian state to exercise a degree of independence. That in itself, I think, would be a radical move, and it would largely result in closer orientation towards China and a freer exchange of Chinese ideas about political and economic development in Australia.
Okay. Yeah. Well, I think we'll wrap it up now then. Thanks so much, guys, for joining me, and hopefully we can have more chats or debates like this in the future.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks for that. Thanks for having us.
See ya.
Thanks, comrades.
All right. Bye.